November 14, 1944. A Tuesday afternoon in a prisoner of war camp outside Fort Harrison, Indiana. In the mess hall, 28 German women sat in stunned silence, staring at what had just been placed before them. On plain white plates, surrounded by glistening red berries, sat generous slices of golden pound cake topped with fresh cream. It was an ordinary weekday, not Christmas, not Easter, not any special occasion they could identify, yet here before them sat dessert that would have been considered extravagant in peacetime Germany, let alone in the middle of a world war. Elfriede Bachmann, a 23-year-old former Signals Corps operator from Munich, felt her hands begin to tremble as she gripped her fork. For 6 weeks since her capture in France, she had been waiting for the cruelty to begin, waiting for the starvation rations, waiting for the brutality that every propaganda film, every party lecture, every training session had promised would be the fate of German soldiers in American hands. Instead, she was looking at pound cake and berries on a Tuesday. Across the table, Brunhilde Hofmeister, a 22-year-old medical assistant from Stuttgart, whispered in German so quiet that only those nearest could hear. "This cannot be real. They are trying to trick us somehow." But the cake was real, the cream was real. The berries, impossibly fresh for November, were undeniably real. Private Lawrence Beckett, a 19-year-old mess hall worker from Illinois, moved between the tables with a metal pitcher, offering coffee refills with the same casual friendliness he might show at a church social back home. He seemed genuinely confused by the German women's lack of enthusiasm for the dessert. The contrast was almost unbearable. These women had been taught that Americans were barely surviving themselves, that their economy was collapsing under the weight of the war, that they could hardly feed their own people, let alone prisoners. Yet here was abundance that exceeded anything most of them had seen in Germany for the past 2 years. Rosemarie Steiner, a 25-year-old former typist from Nuremberg, was the first to actually taste the cake. She cut a small piece with her fork, her movements careful and deliberate, as if the dessert might somehow be poisoned or reveal itself as an elaborate deception. The moment the cake touched her tongue, her eyes closed involuntarily. It was butter-rich, perfectly textured, sweet, but not overwhelmingly so. The berries added a tart brightness that made the whole thing taste like something from a dream of peacetime. She chewed slowly, swallowed, and then did something that surprised even herself. She began to cry. Not loud sobs, but quiet tears that rolled down her cheeks as she took another bite, then another. Around her, other women noticed. Some looked away, embarrassed by this display of emotion. Others felt their own eyes beginning to burn with unshed tears. They had been prepared for many things in American captivity. They had steeled themselves against torture, humiliation, and deprivation. But no one had prepared them for kindness. No one had warned them about pound cake on a Tuesday. And in that moment, sitting in a prisoner of war camp, thousands of miles from home, everything they thought they knew about their enemies began to crack. September 22, 1944. The first transport of German women prisoners arrived at the Fort Harrison facility under gray autumn skies. Elfriede Bachmann stepped off the military truck with her hands clasped behind her back, maintaining the rigid posture she had been taught in the Women's Auxiliary Corps. Around her, 27 other women did the same, their faces carefully arranged into expressions of defiant dignity. They wore the remnants of their gray auxiliary uniforms, some still bearing the insignia they had once worn with pride. Elfriede's uniform was stained and torn from her capture 2 weeks earlier near the Belgian border. She had been operating a signals relay station when American forces overran their position. The speed of the collapse had shocked her. One moment she was transmitting coded messages, the next she was being marched toward waiting trucks with her hands raised. Captain Helen Burkhart stood waiting for them outside the camp administration building. At 37, she was one of the few female officers assigned to oversee prisoner facilities. She had requested this posting specifically, believing that women prisoners would respond better to female authority. Her face showed neither hostility nor excessive warmth as she watched the German women line up for processing. The camp itself was smaller than the massive compounds housing male prisoners across America. It had been hastily converted from a former civilian conservation corps facility and could accommodate fewer than 50 prisoners. Chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire marked the perimeter. Guard towers stood at each corner, but the overall atmosphere was less fortress-like than the women had expected. Sergeant Vernon McKinley, a 29-year-old farm boy from Iowa, who had been deemed essential for domestic duty due to a childhood injury that left him with a pronounced limp, oversaw the initial intake procedures. His manner was businesslike but not harsh. He spoke no German, relying instead on hand gestures and simple English commands that the women struggled to understand. Brunhilde Hofmeister, who had studied some English in school, found herself translating for the others. Her accent was thick and her vocabulary limited, but she managed to convey the basic instructions about camp rules, sleeping arrangements, and daily routines. The women were assigned to 2 long barracks buildings that had been partitioned to provide some privacy. Each woman received a narrow cot, 2 wool blankets, and a small footlocker for personal belongings. Most of them had almost nothing to store. Elfrida's footlocker contained only a battered copy of Goethe's poems and a photograph of her family taken before the war. As evening approached, they were led to the mess hall for their first meal. The room was warm, heated by steam radiators that clanked and hissed. Long tables with attached benches filled the space. American guards stood along the walls, watching but not threatening. When the food was brought out, the German women exchanged confused glances. The portions were substantial: bread, some kind of meat stew, vegetables, and milk. Real milk, not the watered-down substitute they had grown accustomed to in Germany. Elfrida ate mechanically, tasting nothing, her mind trying to reconcile what she was experiencing with what she had been taught to expect. The propaganda had been relentless and specific. Throughout her training in the Women's Auxiliary Corps, Elfrida had attended weekly lectures about what capture would mean. The instructors, usually stern-faced party officials, painted vivid pictures of American savagery. American soldiers, they were told, came from a mongrel nation with no real culture, no discipline, and no respect for the rules of war. Prisoners could expect beatings, starvation, forced labor under brutal conditions, and worse. Women prisoners, the instructors emphasized with particular gravity, would face special dangers. The lectures never explicitly detailed what those dangers were, but the implications hung heavy in the air, making the young women exchange nervous glances. Elfrida remembered one instructor in particular, a woman named Frau Ostermann, who claimed to have intelligence reports from German agents in America. She described a country on the verge of economic collapse, where bread lines stretched for blocks and ordinary citizens were already going hungry. How could such a desperate nation possibly feed prisoners of war adequately? The logic seemed irrefutable at the time. The training films were even more powerful. Grainy footage purported to show American prison camps where skeletal prisoners huddled in freezing barracks, their faces hollow with starvation. The narration explained that Americans viewed German prisoners as subhuman, unworthy of basic dignity or care. One film showed what was claimed to be American guards laughing as prisoners fought over scraps of moldy bread. Brunhilde, sitting next to Elfrida in the darkened screening room back in Stuttgart, had whispered that the footage looked staged, but neither of them dared say so aloud. Questioning the training materials was tantamount to questioning the Reich itself. Rosemarie Steiner had believed every word of the propaganda completely. Growing up in Nuremberg, she had been steeped in party ideology from childhood. Her father was a mid-level official who brought home stories from his work about American decadence and weakness. When she joined the Auxiliary Corps as a typist, she saw it as her patriotic duty. The idea that Americans might treat prisoners well seemed not just unlikely, but impossible to her. It contradicted everything her worldview was built upon. Even Gertraud Fischer, who was more skeptical by nature, had absorbed enough of the messaging to expect hardship. As a translator, she had worked with confiscated American documents and noticed that they seemed to show a country with substantial resources. But when she mentioned this observation to her supervisor, she was told that such documents were obviously falsified for propaganda purposes. The real America, she was assured, was struggling desperately. So when the women arrived at Fort Harrison, they came armored with expectations of suffering. They had mentally prepared themselves to endure deprivation with dignity, to resist interrogation, to maintain their loyalty to Germany no matter what hardships they faced. What they had not prepared for, what no lecture or film or training session had equipped them to handle, was the possibility that their captors might simply treat them like human beings. That first dinner at Fort Harrison haunted Elfrida for days afterward. She lay on her narrow cot in the barracks, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what she had experienced. The meal had been simple by American standards, just basic mess hall fare. But to women who had spent the last year watching rations shrink in Germany, it was bewildering. The meat stew had contained actual chunks of beef, not the mysterious, stretched protein they had grown accustomed to back home. The bread was white and soft, made from real wheat flour without sawdust or potato flour extenders. The vegetables, while canned, were plentiful. And the milk, that had been the most shocking part. Real whole milk served in metal cups that were refilled upon request. Private Beckett had walked among the tables with a large pitcher, offering more to anyone who wanted it. Most of the German women had been too stunned to accept. Milk had become a precious commodity in Germany, reserved primarily for children and the sick. Brunhilde had been the first to voice what many were thinking. She leaned close to Elfrida during that first meal and whispered in German, "They are fattening us up for something. This is how you prepare livestock before slaughter." The comment should have seemed paranoid, but it resonated with several women who overheard. It was the only explanation that fit their worldview. Surely this abundance could not be standard treatment for enemy prisoners. Rosemarie had a different theory. She suggested that perhaps they were being fed well temporarily, that once the Americans had extracted whatever information or propaganda value they wanted, the real deprivation would begin. This was psychological warfare, she insisted, designed to make them grateful and compliant before the cruelty started. But as days passed and the meals continued to be substantial, these theories became harder to maintain. Breakfast brought oatmeal with brown sugar, scrambled eggs that seemed impossibly rich, and toast with real butter. Lunch was sandwiches made with thick sliced bread and generous portions of cheese or meat. Dinner varied, but always included protein, vegetables, and bread. There was coffee at every meal, real coffee, not the chicory substitute they had been drinking in Germany. Gertrude, whose role as translator brought her into more contact with the American staff, began cautiously asking questions. Her English was halting, but she managed to inquire whether this was special treatment. Sergeant McKinley looked genuinely confused by the question. "This is just how we feed people," he said simply, as if there was nothing remarkable about it at all. The confusion deepened when some of the women were assigned to work details in the kitchen. They expected to find evidence that the Americans were feeding prisoners better than their own soldiers, perhaps as part of some elaborate deception. Instead, they discovered that the guards ate essentially the same food from the same kitchen. If anything, the guards sometimes had slightly smaller portions. This observation circulated through the barracks in whispered conversations. Nothing made sense anymore. The propaganda had been so certain, so specific, yet the reality they were experiencing contradicted it at every turn. The woman who first dared to speak the unthinkable was not Elfrida or any of the main group, but a quiet 31-year-old supply clerk named Greta Wurm from Augsburg. She had been in the camp for 3 weeks when she finally voiced what many were beginning to wonder but were too afraid to articulate. It happened during evening recreation time when the women were permitted to gather in the common room. Greta sat among a small group that included Elfrida, Brunhilde, and Rosemarie. She had been staring at her hands for several minutes, her expression troubled, before she spoke. What if we were lied to? The words fell into the conversation like a stone into still water. The other women froze. Rosemary's face flushed with anger. "You are speaking treason," she hissed in German. "To question the information we were given is to question the Reich itself." But Greta did not back down. Her voice remained quiet but steady. "I am questioning whether the people who trained us actually knew the truth about America. There is a difference." Elfriede felt her heart racing. This was dangerous territory. Even here, thousands of miles from Germany, the habits of caution ran deep. There could be informers among them, women who might report such conversations if they were ever repatriated. Yet she found herself unable to dismiss Greta's words. Brunhilde, ever practical, asked the question that mattered most. If they lied about how Americans would treat us, what else did they lie about? The silence that followed was profound. Each woman in that circle was privately conducting an inventory of everything they had been taught, everything they had believed. If the foundation was false, what did that mean for the entire structure built upon it? Greta continued, emboldened by the lack of immediate condemnation. "I worked in supply requisition in Augsburg. I saw the reports about food shortages, about the increasing difficulty in feeding our own people. Yet we were told that America was starving, that their economy was collapsing. How can a collapsing economy feed its prisoners better than we fed our own soldiers?" Rosemary stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I will not listen to this defeatist talk." She walked away, but notably, she did not report the conversation to the camp authorities. That night, Elfriede lay awake processing Greta's questions. She thought about the signals she had transmitted during her service, coded messages she had never been permitted to understand. She thought about the newspapers she had read in Germany, always full of stories about American weakness and imminent collapse. She thought about the bread she had eaten that evening, soft and white and plentiful. What if everything had been inverted? What if the strong had been portrayed as weak and the weak as strong? The implications were staggering. If they had been deceived about something as basic as American living conditions, what else had been distorted or fabricated entirely? Greta's question had opened a door that could not easily be closed. In whispered conversations over the following days, more women began cautiously examining their assumptions. Not all were ready to abandon their beliefs, but seeds of doubt had been planted in even the most resistant minds. The pound cake arrived without fanfare or explanation. Private Beckett and 2 other kitchen workers simply wheeled out carts bearing the dessert plates, as they had done dozens of times before. To the American staff, this was routine. Tuesday's menu included pound cake with berries. Nothing special, just the regular rotation of desserts that kept mess hall meals from becoming monotonous. But to the German women, it was a moment of profound cognitive dissonance. Elfriede stared at her plate, her mind racing through calculations. In Germany, butter had been rationed severely for over a year. Eggs were precious. Sugar was carefully controlled. The amount of these ingredients required to make even one cake would represent weeks of rations for an entire family. Yet here sat individual slices for 28 enemy prisoners on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Gertrude reached out and touched the cream with one finger as if testing whether it might be an illusion. "It is real," she whispered unnecessarily. The cream left a white mark on her fingertip. She brought it to her lips and tasted it, then closed her eyes. Brunhilde, sitting across from Elfriede, had gone completely pale. Her medical training had taught her about nutrition, about caloric requirements, about the physical effects of deprivation. She had seen malnourished patients in Stuttgart before she joined the Auxiliary Corps. She understood what food meant in concrete, physical terms. This dessert represented more calories than many German civilians now consumed in an entire day. Around them, the American guards seemed oblivious to the drama unfolding. Sergeant McKinley was discussing something with Captain Burkhart near the door, probably routine administrative matters. Private Beckett was refilling coffee cups, humming tunelessly to himself. None of them appeared to recognize that they had just shattered the worldview of 24 women with a simple dessert. Rosemarie was the last to pick up her fork. She had been the most resistant to questioning the propaganda, the most insistent that their treatment was temporary or deceptive. But even she could not explain away pound cake and berries on a Tuesday. She cut a small piece, placed it in her mouth, and chewed slowly. Her expression did not change, but tears began sliding down her cheeks. One by one, the other women began to eat. Some cried openly like Rosemarie. Others ate in silence, their faces reflecting internal struggles. A few, including Greta, ate with something approaching anger, as if each bite was an accusation against those who had lied to them. Elfrida took her time with each bite, trying to memorize the taste, the texture, the reality of it. This was not propaganda. This was not deception. This was simply how America fed people, even its enemies. When the plates were empty, the women sat in unusual silence. Normally, there was conversation during meals, quiet exchanges in German about daily concerns or memories of home. But today, words seemed inadequate. They had just experienced something that could not be easily processed or explained. Private Beckett collected the empty plates, seemingly pleased that the dessert had been consumed. "Nice to see you ladies enjoying the cake," he said cheerfully in English that most of them barely understood. For him, it was just another Tuesday. The pound cake incident became a dividing line in the barracks. Before the cake and after the cake, women began measuring their evolving understanding of their situation in relation to that Tuesday afternoon. Some, like Rosemarie, tried desperately to maintain their previous beliefs despite mounting evidence. She argued that the Americans must be feeding them well as part of a propaganda effort, perhaps planning to photograph them looking healthy to use in their own psychological warfare. Others would see the pictures and think that Germany starved its own soldiers, she insisted during a late-night conversation in the barracks. But even as she spoke, her voice lacked conviction. Elfrida found herself in an unexpected position as a leader among those willing to question their assumptions. Her signals training had taught her to think analytically, to process information logically. She began keeping a mental list of observations that contradicted what they had been told about America. The list grew daily. The guards were well-fed, but not luxuriously so, suggesting this was normal rather than exceptional. The camp facilities, while simple, were weatherproof and adequately heated. Medical care was provided promptly when Brunhilde treated a prisoner who developed a fever. Work assignments were reasonable, never approaching the brutal forced labor they had been warned to expect. Most tellingly, the American staff seemed genuinely confused when prisoners expressed surprise at decent treatment. Brunhilde approached the situation from her medical perspective. She had been observing the physical condition of both prisoners and guards since their arrival. After 6 weeks in captivity, none of the German women showed signs of malnutrition. If anything, several who had been underweight due to food shortages in Germany were beginning to look healthier. Meanwhile, the American soldiers appeared well-nourished, but not overfed. Their rations seemed adequate, but not lavish. This suggested a society with sufficient resources to feed both its military and its prisoners without strain. The conclusion was unavoidable. America was not a starving nation on the brink of collapse. Gertrude's role as informal translator brought her into frequent contact with Private Beckett and other staff members. Her English improved rapidly through these interactions, and she began to pick up casual comments that revealed much about American society. Beckett talked about his family's farm in Illinois, about abundant harvests, about his mother's letters complaining about rationing, but in tones that suggested inconvenience rather than desperation. He mentioned that his younger sister was gaining weight because she ate too many sweets. The casual mention of excess rather than scarcity was jarring. One evening, Gertrude asked him directly about food conditions in America. Her English was still imperfect, but she managed to convey the question. Beckett looked puzzled by her interest. "We have rationing like everywhere else in the war," he explained. "But nobody's going hungry. My ma complains she can't make all her usual recipes, but we eat fine." This simple statement, delivered without any apparent agenda, carried more weight than 1,000 propaganda speeches. The whispers in the barracks grew more frequent and more daring. Small groups of women began discussing not just their treatment in the camp, but larger questions about what they had been told versus what appeared to be true. When Captain Burkhart announced that several prisoners would be assigned to kitchen duties, Elfrida volunteered immediately. She wanted to see the source of their meals firsthand, to understand the logistics behind the food that kept appearing on their plates. Brunhilde and Gertrude volunteered as well, driven by similar curiosity. Rosemarie notably did not volunteer. The kitchen assignment began the following Monday morning. Private Beckett met the 3 German women at the mess hall entrance at 5:30 when the camp was still dark and quiet. He led them through the dining area into the large kitchen beyond. What they saw made all 3 women stop in their tracks. The storage room, visible through an open door, was stocked with supplies that would have seemed impossible in Germany. Sacks of flour and sugar were stacked in neat rows. Canned goods filled metal shelving units that stretched from floor to ceiling. A walk-in refrigerator, something Elfrida had only seen in commercial establishments before the war, hummed quietly in the corner. Beckett noticed their stunned expressions but misinterpreted the cause. "I know it's not fancy," he said apologetically. "Nothing like a real restaurant kitchen. But we make do." Brunhilde could not help herself. She spoke in halting English, gesturing at the storage room. "This is making do?" Beckett looked genuinely confused by her tone. "Well, yeah, we feed about 200 people here total, counting prisoners and staff. Need enough supplies to get through the week between deliveries." The math was staggering. If this was enough for 200 people for 1 week, and this was considered merely adequate, what did abundance look like in America? Gertrude was assigned to help prepare breakfast, while Elfrida and Brunhilde worked on initial food preparation for the day's other meals. As they worked, they observed the casual abundance that surrounded them. Eggs were used generously, dozens at a time for the morning scramble. Butter came in large blocks that were measured out in quantities that would have represented a month's ration for a German family. When Brunhilde accidentally dropped a potato, she instinctively moved to pick it up and salvage it. Beckett waved her off. "It rolled under the equipment. Just grab another from the sack. There's plenty. Plenty." The word echoed in her mind. During a break, the German women were given coffee and allowed to sit at a small table in the corner of the kitchen. Elfriede watched as kitchen staff prepared the noon meal with an efficiency that spoke of routine rather than special effort. Everything about the operation suggested that this level of provisioning was normal, sustainable, and unremarkable. As they returned to work, Gertrude struck up a conversation with one of the American cooks, an older woman named Mrs. Patterson, who worked as a civilian contractor. Through a mixture of English and gestures, Gertrude learned that Mrs. Patterson had 2 sons serving overseas in Europe. She worried about them constantly, but trusted that the army was feeding them adequately. The irony was not lost on Gertrude. This American mother worried about her sons, who were probably eating better than most German soldiers, while in Germany, mothers worried about sons who were genuinely going hungry. December 25, 1944, arrived with fresh snow covering the Fort Harrison camp. The German women woke to find that the barracks had been decorated overnight with paper chains and pine boughs. Someone had placed a small evergreen tree in the common room, adorned with handmade ornaments. Captain Burkhart had authorized a special Christmas celebration, believing it might ease the homesickness that hung heavy over the prisoners during the holiday season. The women gathered in the mess hall at noon, uncertain what to expect. What they found left them speechless. The tables had been covered with white cloths. Pine branches and candles created centerpieces. But it was the food that created the most profound impact. Roasted turkey, golden brown and glistening. mashed potatoes with gravy, stuffing seasoned with herbs, green beans, cranberry sauce, fresh baked rolls with butter, and for dessert, apple pie and pumpkin pie, both served with whipped cream. Elfrida stood frozen in the doorway, unable to process what she was seeing. This exceeded anything she had experienced even in peacetime Germany. This was abundance that seemed almost obscene given that a war was raging, that men were dying, that the world was consumed by conflict. Brunhilde began crying before she even sat down. The sight of such plenty while knowing her family in Stuttgart was likely making do with turnip soup and black bread was more than she could bear. Gertrude placed a hand on her shoulder but said nothing. What words could possibly address this moment? Rosemary looked angry. Her face flushed red as she stared at the laden tables. "This is wrong," she said in German. "This is them mocking us, showing us what we cannot have." But her protest rang hollow even to her own ears. The American staff was eating the same meal at adjacent tables. Private Beckett was laughing with Sergeant McKinley about something. Captain Burkhart was helping Mrs. Patterson carry additional serving platters. This was not mockery. This was simply Christmas in America. As the German women ate, many could not stop crying. The food was delicious, perfectly prepared, generous in portion. Each bite was a revelation and an accusation. Greta spoke what others were thinking. How can they feed prisoners like this when we were told they were starving? How can this be ordinary for them? An older prisoner named Katha, who had been quiet until now, set down her fork and addressed the group in German. "My husband fought in the First War. He was captured by Americans in 1918. When he came home, he told me they fed him better than our own army had. I thought he was exaggerating to make himself feel better about being captured. I thought he was ashamed and making excuses. Now I understand he was telling the truth." The revelation that this was not new, that America had treated prisoners well even in the previous war, added another layer to their understanding. This was not a temporary strategy or a special circumstance. This appeared to be simply how America operated. After the meal, Captain Burkhart stood and addressed the prisoners in English, with Gertrude translating. "I know you are far from home. I know this is a difficult day, but I hope this meal reminds you that even in war, we can maintain our humanity." That evening, the women gathered in their barracks. The conversation was subdued but honest. One by one, even the most resistant among them began admitting that everything they had been taught about America was wrong. January brought bitter cold to Indiana and a new revelation for the German prisoners. During recreation time, some of the American guards would read letters from home aloud to each other, a common practice to share news and maintain morale. Gertrude, whose English comprehension had improved dramatically, began listening to these casual readings. What she heard challenged another assumption. Private Beckett received a letter from his mother in Illinois that he read portions of to Sergeant McKinley. His mother complained about rationing, about giving up sugar coupons, and dealing with meat shortages. But her complaints were framed in terms of inconvenience and adjustment rather than desperation. She wrote about having to be more creative with recipes, about missing certain foods, about the annoyance of waiting in lines, but she never mentioned hunger. She never described deprivation that threatened health or survival. Gertrude reported this conversation to Elfrida that evening. "They are being rationed," she explained, "just like us. But their rationing means doing without luxury, while our rationing has meant doing without necessities." Elfrida absorbed this information thoughtfully. She had been examining every piece of evidence she encountered, building a more accurate picture of American society to replace the distorted one she had been given. The letters provided crucial context. Americans were indeed sacrificing for the war effort, but from a position of such abundance that their sacrifices looked nothing like German ones. Brunhilde had a similar experience when helping Dr. Ashford in the medical office. He received a letter from his wife in Massachusetts that mentioned their daughter complaining about not having enough sugar for baking. The complaint was treated as a minor childhood disappointment, not a serious hardship. Dr. Ashford chuckled about it, commenting that rationing was teaching his daughter the value of appreciation. The casual tone revealed everything. Over the following weeks, the German women became inadvertent students of American home front life through these overheard letters. They learned about war bond drives and scrap metal collections. They heard about women taking factory jobs and families planting victory gardens. They discovered that Americans were indeed mobilized for war and making genuine sacrifices. But the baseline from which they sacrificed was so much higher than the German baseline that the end result was still relative comfort. This understanding brought a new kind of pain. Rosemarie, who had been most resistant to accepting the truth about America, finally broke down one evening after overhearing a letter about a church social with donated cakes and pies. "My mother's last letter before I was captured," she said quietly to the group in the barracks. "She wrote that my little brother was always hungry, that she watered down the soup to make it last longer, that she gave her portions to the children. That was normal in Germany by 1944. That was what we were defending." The contrast was unbearable. These women had served what they believed was a strong, superior nation defending itself against weak, degenerate enemies. Now they understood they had served a nation that could not even feed its own children while fighting enemies who could feed even their prisoners with abundance. Elfrida watched as the last resistance crumbled among her fellow prisoners. The evidence had become overwhelming. America was not weak or collapsing or desperate. The barracks split into two distinct groups by late January. The larger group, led by Elfrida, had accepted that they had been systematically deceived about America and were trying to process the implications. The smaller group, stubbornly loyal to their original beliefs, insisted there must be explanations they were missing. Rosemarie had moved between groups several times before finally joining Elfrida's side, but three women remained adamantly resistant. The confrontation came to a head on a cold evening in early February. Liesel Krauss, one of the resistors, accused the others of being brainwashed by American propaganda. "You have forgotten who you are," she said angrily in German. "You have let them make you doubt your own country, your own people. You are traitors to the Reich." Elfrida, normally quiet and measured, responded with unexpected force. "What we have forgotten is lies. What we are remembering is how to see truth. If that makes us traitors, then perhaps the real treason was believing the lies in the first place." The argument escalated quickly. Liesel pointed out that they were only seeing what the Americans wanted them to see, that this camp might be exceptional, that conditions elsewhere might be different. Brunhilde countered with medical facts about nutrition and health. "Look at us," she gestured around the room. "Look at how we have been treated. This is not propaganda, this is reality." Gertrude added observations from her translation work about the consistency of American behavior, about the casual way abundance was treated as normal. Greta spoke about supply logistics and economic capacity. The evidence mounted from multiple perspectives, but Liesel and her two supporters refused to yield. They argued that accepting the truth about America meant accepting that everything they had fought for was based on lies, and that was too much to bear. Better to believe in a massive deception by their captors than to accept that their own leaders had deceived them. The confrontation revealed the psychological cost of awakening. For those who accepted the truth, there was grief and anger and confusion, but also a path forward. They could acknowledge they had been misled, that they had served unknowingly, that they could choose differently now with better information. For those who refused the truth, there was only rigidity and increasing isolation. Captain Burkhardt, hearing about the division from Gertrude, made a decision to address it directly. She called a meeting with all the prisoners and spoke plainly through Gertrude's translation. "You are entitled to your beliefs, but you are not entitled to create hostility in this camp. Whether you accept what you have experienced here or not, you will treat each other with respect." The confrontation gradually subsided into an uneasy coexistence. The two groups largely avoided each other, sitting at separate tables during meals. maintaining separate conversations during recreation time. But the division was instructive. It showed that accepting truth required courage that not everyone possessed. As Elfrida wrote in a small notebook she had been given, some cages are locked from the inside. You can open the door, but the prisoner must choose to walk through it. Not everyone is ready to be free from their beliefs, even when those beliefs are proven false. The idea came from Mrs. Patterson, the civilian cook who had observed the German women's reactions to American food with sympathetic understanding. She approached Captain Burkhart with a proposal. These girls are fascinated by the cooking. What if we taught them some American recipes, give them something constructive to focus on? Burkhart saw the value immediately. Shared activity, particularly around food, could build bridges more effectively than any formal program. She approved the proposal and announced that interested prisoners could attend voluntary baking lessons twice weekly. 12 women signed up immediately, including Elfrida, Brunhilde, and Gertrude. Rosemary hesitated but eventually added her name. The first lesson focused on the pound cake that had caused such upheaval weeks earlier. Mrs. Patterson demonstrated the process step by step, with Gertrude translating. The German women watched with intense concentration as she creamed butter and sugar, added eggs one at a time, alternated dry ingredients with milk. The technique was familiar, but the generous quantities were not. Mrs. Patterson let each woman practice the creaming technique. Elfrida found the repetitive motion soothing, almost meditative. There was something healing about creating rather than simply consuming, about learning rather than merely experiencing. When the cakes went into the ovens, filling the kitchen with buttery sweetness, several women became emotional again. But this time the tears were different, less about grief and more about gratitude. They were being taught, included, treated as people worth investing in. The second lesson covered biscuits, a thoroughly American creation that fascinated the German women. The technique of cutting cold butter into flour, the careful handling to avoid overworking the dough, the transformation in the oven from rough lumps to golden, flaky rounds. Brunhilde excelled at this, her medical precision translating well to baking technique. As weeks passed, the lessons expanded to include apple pie, chocolate cake, oatmeal cookies. Each session was both culinary instruction and cultural exchange. Mrs. Patterson talked about recipes passed down from her grandmother, about baking for church socials, about the role of food in American community life. The German women began sharing their own baking traditions in return. Gertrude described her mother's Christmas stollen, the careful preparation that began weeks in advance. Rosemary talked about the elaborate torts of Nuremberg, creations that required skills passed through generations. Elfrida mentioned her grandmother's simple butter cookies, made with ingredients that were now impossible to obtain in Germany. The exchange revealed common ground. Both cultures valued baking as an expression of care, celebration, and connection. The specific recipes differed, but the underlying meaning was universal. Food was how you showed love, how you marked important occasions, how you built community. Private Beckett, observing one of the sessions, commented to Sergeant McKinley that the German women seemed happier during baking lessons than at any other time. "There is something about working with your hands, creating something good," McKinley replied. "Makes people remember they are more than just their circumstances." March brought devastating news that shattered any remaining illusions the German women might have held. Reports from Germany filtered through official channels and were shared cautiously by Captain Burkhart. Allied forces advancing deeper into German territory encountered civilian populations in dire condition. The stories painted a picture of severe food shortages, bombed-out cities, and a civilian infrastructure on the verge of collapse. Elfrida received her first letter from home since capture. It had taken 5 months to reach her through Red Cross channels. Her mother's handwriting was shaky, the paper thin and poor quality. The contents made Elfrida physically ill. Her mother wrote carefully, knowing the letter would be censored, but the meaning was clear. Her younger sister had stopped menstruating due to malnutrition. Her father gave most of his rations to the children. They burned furniture for heat because coal was unavailable. The family was surviving, but barely. And this was in Munich, a major city, not some isolated rural area. The contrast between her mother's suffering and her own relative comfort created a guilt so profound that Elfriede could not eat for 2 days. Brunhilde received worse news. Her entire family in Stuttgart had been killed in an Allied bombing raid 4 months earlier. She learned this through an official Red Cross notification, sterile and bureaucratic. Her parents, 2 younger brothers, and her grandmother, all gone while she had been eating pound cake and learning to bake biscuits in an American prison camp. She retreated into herself for a week, speaking to no one, mechanically going through daily routines. Other letters trickled in with similar themes. Families hungry, cities destroyed, the civilian population bearing unsustainable burdens. Gertrude's brother wrote that he had been drafted at 16, sent to the Eastern Front with minimal training. Her mother included a separate note begging Gertrude to stay safe in American captivity, suggesting she understood that her daughter was actually safer as a prisoner than she would be in Germany. The psychological impact was devastating. The women had been grappling with the realization that their own nation had lied to them about America. Now they faced the reality that while they had been prisoners eating better than they ever had before, their families had been starving. The guilt was compounded by helplessness. There was nothing they could do to help from thousands of miles away behind prison fencing. Rosemarie broke down completely after receiving a letter from a neighbor informing her that her mother had died of pneumonia, weakened by malnutrition. She had been one of the last holdouts against accepting the truth about American abundance. Now, she was forced to reconcile that truth with the death of her mother from deprivation. The Americans had not lied about their capacity. Germany had lied about everything. The evening after Rosemarie received her news, Captain Burkhardt called an assembly. She had been informed about the letters and their contents. Her face showed genuine compassion as she addressed the prisoners through Gertrude's translation. "I know many of you have received difficult news from home. I know you are struggling with circumstances beyond your control. Please understand that you are not responsible for what is happening in Germany. You cannot help your families from here, but you can honor them by taking care of yourselves." The words were meant to comfort, but they rang hollow for women drowning in survivor's guilt. The guilt manifested differently in each woman. Elfriede stopped taking second helpings at meals, trying to eat only what she imagined her family might have access to. It was a futile gesture that changed nothing, but she could not bring herself to enjoy abundance while her mother and sister suffered. Brunhilde threw herself into work with Dr. Ashford, volunteering for every available shift. If she could not help her own family, at least she could help others. The medical work gave her purpose and distraction from grief. She became almost obsessive about it, working until exhaustion made sleep possible. Gertrude wrote long letters to her mother, carefully worded to pass censorship, trying to describe conditions in the camp without revealing how well they were being treated. She knew her mother would want her to be safe, but she could not bring herself to describe the meals, the warm barracks, the kindness. It felt obscene. Rosemarie's guilt took a darker form. She began refusing food altogether, pushing her plate away untouched at meals. When Captain Burkhardt noticed and ordered her to eat, she complied minimally, consuming only enough to avoid medical intervention. She was punishing herself for surviving while her mother died. The other women watched her deteriorate with concern and recognition. They all felt the same impulse to reject the abundance that highlighted their family's deprivation. Private Beckett, noticing the change in the prisoner's behavior, asked Gertrude what was wrong. She explained about the letters, about the news from Germany, about the guilt of eating well while families starved. His young face showed distress. "But it's not your fault. You didn't choose to be here." Gertrude appreciated his kindness, but tried to help him understand. In our hearts, we know that rationally. But guilt is not rational. How can we sit down to turkey and pie, knowing our mothers are boiling potato peels for soup? Beckett had no answer. The cultural exchange that had been developing through baking lessons took on a bittersweet quality. Mrs. Patterson noticed that the German women no longer showed enthusiasm for the creations they made. They went through the motions competently but joylessly. One afternoon she addressed this directly. "I know you are hurting. I know you feel guilty about having enough to eat, but starving yourselves here does not feed your families there. It only creates more suffering in the world." The logic was sound, but emotion rarely responds to logic. The women knew intellectually that their deprivation would not alleviate their family's hunger, but the heart demanded some form of sacrifice, some gesture of solidarity with those suffering at home. Dr. Ashford, concerned about Rosemarie's deteriorating condition, brought her to the medical office for a direct conversation. He spoke slowly so Gertrude could translate accurately. "Your mother would not want you to destroy yourself. The best way to honor her memory is to live well, to become the person she hoped you would be." Rosemarie looked at him with hollow eyes. "How do you know what my mother would want? You never knew her." Dr. Ashford nodded, accepting the rebuke. "You are right. I did not know her, but I know that mothers generally want their children to survive and thrive. I know that grief is necessary, but self-destruction is not." It took 3 weeks and considerable effort from both American staff and fellow prisoners, but Rosemarie eventually began eating normally again. The concept was so foreign to German thinking that it took multiple conversations before Elfriede truly understood it. She was working in the camp office, helping file paperwork, when she found a document outlining regulations for prisoner treatment. The language referred repeatedly to the Geneva Convention, to standards of dignity, to requirements that went far beyond mere survival. She brought her questions to Captain Burkhardt, with Gertrude translating. "Why do you feed us so well? Why treat enemies with such care?" Burkhardt considered her response carefully. She wanted to give an answer that was both truthful and comprehensible. "Because how we treat you reflects who we are, not who you are. We do not feed you well because you deserve it as individuals. We feed you well because we believe all people deserve basic dignity, and because maintaining that principle, even with our enemies, is what separates civilization from barbarism." The answer was revolutionary to women raised under a system that divided humanity into worthy and unworthy, that justified any treatment of designated enemies. Elfriede pressed further. "But we were your enemies. We fought against you. Does that not matter?" "It matters," Burkhardt acknowledged, "but it does not change our obligation to treat you humanely. You are prisoners of war, not criminals. You were following orders from your government, just as our soldiers follow orders from ours. The war is between nations, not between individual people." Sergeant McKinley, overhearing the conversation, added his perspective. "My grandfather came from Germany in 1885. I grew up eating German food, hearing German songs. You are not so different from my own family. The war made us enemies, but it did not make you less human." This idea that shared humanity transcended national conflict was something the German women had never encountered in their own ideology. They had been taught that different peoples had fundamentally different values, different worth, different destinies. The notion that Americans would feed German prisoners the same food as American soldiers because both were equally human was almost incomprehensible. Over several weeks, through many conversations, the American philosophy gradually became clearer. It was not about weakness or naivety. It was a deliberate choice based on principles that Americans believed were universal. Dr. Ashford explained it in medical terms during one of Brunhilde's shifts. "If I only treated patients I agreed with or liked, I would be a poor doctor. Medical ethics require that I provide the same care to everyone who needs it. American principles require that we treat all people with basic dignity regardless of whether they are friends or enemies. Brunhilde found this framework easier to understand through the lens of medical ethics. The Hippocratic Oath transcended politics. Perhaps American treatment of prisoners operated under a similar code. The understanding brought both comfort and pain. Comfort because it meant their treatment was genuine, not a trick or temporary strategy. Pain because it highlighted how different American values were from what they had been taught to defend. April 19, 1945 brought the announcement that would change everything. Germany was collapsing. The war in Europe would end within weeks. Plans were being developed for prisoner repatriation. Captain Burckhardt called an assembly to explain the process. Within months, possibly sooner, the German women would be processed for return to their homeland. She outlined the procedures, the timeline, the logistics. Her tone was professional but not unkind. The women listened in stunned silence. What had once seemed like a distant eventuality was now imminent reality. They would be going home. But what was home anymore? Elfrida lay awake that night thinking about Munich. Her last letter from her mother had described a city barely recognizable, buildings reduced to rubble, infrastructure destroyed, food supplies critically low. The family apartment had survived, but many neighbors' homes had not. What would she be returning to? Brunhilde had no family left to return to. Stuttgart held only graves and memories of people who no longer existed. The thought of walking through her destroyed hometown alone, with no one waiting for her, was unbearable. She confided in Elfrida that she was terrified of repatriation. What purpose would her life have in a devastated Germany with no family? Gertraud faced a different fear. Her family had survived, but they were struggling desperately. She would return to be another mouth to feed in a household that could barely sustain itself. Her presence would be a burden, not a blessing. The skills she had learned, her improved English, her understanding of American culture, would all be useless in ruined Germany. Rosemarie's fear was the most complex. She would be returning as a failed soldier, a woman who had been captured and then treated well by enemies. In the rigid ideology she had been raised in, this made her suspect. Had she been corrupted by American influence? Would she be trusted? More importantly, could she pretend that she had not learned what she now knew about the lies she had been told? The conversations in the barracks took on a desperate quality. Women who had been looking forward to freedom now dreaded it. They had found something unexpected in American captivity: stability, adequate food, purposeful work and treatment as human beings. What they were being offered in return was freedom to return to chaos, deprivation, and a society built on foundations they no longer believed in. Greta voiced what many were thinking. What if we are better off here? What if going home is actually worse than staying? The question was seditious, unthinkable, yet undeniably present in many minds. How could returning to freedom in their own country be less appealing than remaining in enemy captivity? Private Beckett, overhearing some of these conversations, was genuinely confused. You should be happy. You are going home. You will be free. Gertraud tried to explain. Free to what? Free to starve in the ruins of our cities? Free to face suspicion from our own people? Free to pretend we did not learn the truth about what we were serving? May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. Day arrived with the same church bells and celebrations the competitor's script had described, but for the German women at Fort Harrison, the day brought profound uncertainty rather than simple relief. The war was over. Their nation had surrendered unconditionally. Within weeks, they would begin the journey home to a country that no longer existed in the form they had known. Captain Burckhardt gathered the prisoners that afternoon for what would be one of their final assemblies as a group. Her words, translated carefully by Gertraud, addressed the complexity of their situation with unusual candor. You are going home to difficult circumstances. You will face hunger, destruction, and suspicion. Some of your own people may view you as failures for being captured. Others may question whether you were influenced by American propaganda. I cannot change those realities, but I can ask you to remember what you experienced here. Elfrida felt tears beginning as Burkhart continued. You came here believing Americans were your cruel enemies. You learned that we are simply people, flawed and complicated like all people, but trying to maintain certain principles even in wartime. When you return to Germany, you will have a choice. You can pretend this experience never happened, that you learned nothing, that everything you were originally taught was correct. Or you can carry the truth with you and let it shape how you rebuild your lives and your country. The words resonated deeply. These women had undergone a transformation that could not be undone. They had seen behind the propaganda, experienced an alternative to the ideology they had been raised in, discovered that former enemies could show unexpected kindness. That knowledge was now part of them. Brunhilde spoke up, her voice shaky but determined. We will remember. How could we forget? Every meal we eat in Germany, if we are fortunate enough to have meals, will remind us of the abundance we experienced here as prisoners. Rosemary added quietly, I will tell my future children, if I am blessed to have children, that Americans fed their enemies better than our own nation fed its people. That their soldiers showed mercy when they could have shown cruelty. This is truth worth preserving. Over the following days, the women made a pact among themselves. They would not lie about their treatment. If asked, they would tell the truth about American camps, about adequate food and medical care, about being treated with basic dignity. They understood this might make them unpopular, might cause problems with authorities in occupied Germany. But they had spent too long living with lies. They would not add more lies to the ones that had already caused so much suffering. Mrs. Patterson organized a final baking session. The German women prepared pound cake together one last time, measuring ingredients with practiced precision. As they worked, Mrs. Patterson spoke about her hope that they would carry these skills home, that someday when Germany recovered, they might bake these American recipes and remember that even in the darkest times, people could choose kindness over cruelty. 20 years later, Elfrida Bachmann-Muller stood in her kitchen in reconstructed Munich, preparing pound cake for her daughter's birthday celebration. The recipe was the one Mrs. Patterson had taught her in an Indiana prison camp in 1945. Her daughter, 14-year-old Anna, watched with interest as her mother carefully creamed butter and sugar. Mama, why do you always make this American cake for special occasions? Anna asked. We have so many good German cakes. Elfrida paused, considering how much to tell her daughter. Anna had grown up in the new Germany, a country rebuilt with American assistance through the Marshall Plan, a nation that had confronted its past and chosen a different path. But she had not lived through the war, had not experienced the transformation her mother had undergone. She decided her daughter deserved the truth. This cake represents the moment I understood that everything I had been taught about enemies and superiority was a lie. When I was a prisoner of war, younger than you are now, Americans served us this cake on an ordinary Tuesday. That simple act of kindness shattered my entire worldview. Anna listened as her mother described Fort Harrison, Captain Burkhart, Private Beckett, and the other people who had treated enemy prisoners with unexpected dignity. She spoke about the guilt of eating well while German families starved, about learning that propaganda had inverted truth, about choosing to remember kindness rather than succumb to bitterness. The story had become part of Elfrida's mission. She had returned to Germany in 1945 as promised, had faced the devastation and suspicion, had married a man who had also been a prisoner of war and understood her experiences. Together, they had participated in rebuilding not just buildings but values, helping create a Germany that rejected the ideology that had led to such destruction. Brunhilde had become a nurse in the new German healthcare system, implementing standards of care she had learned from Dr. Ashford. She never married, dedicating her life to healing as a form of ongoing redemption. She and Elfrida remained close friends, often discussing how their time at Fort Harrison had shaped their entire lives. Gertrude had become a translator for the American diplomatic mission in Germany, using her language skills to facilitate understanding between former enemies who were now allies. Her fluency in English, developed in that prison camp, had become her career foundation. Rosemarie had struggled the most with reintegration, but eventually found Peace Teaching School in Nuremberg. She made sure her students learned accurate history, including the parts that were uncomfortable to confront. She often said that the best way to honor her mother's memory was to ensure the next generation understood the cost of lies. The pound cake became Elfrida's tangible link to that transformative period. Each time she baked it, she remembered that Tuesday afternoon when her certainties crumbled. She remembered Mrs. Patterson's patient teaching, Captain Burkhart's principled leadership, and the simple truth that people could choose to treat even their enemies with dignity. As Elfrida placed the finished cake on the table and her family gathered to celebrate, she reflected on the unexpected legacy of that dessert. It had been more than food. It had been evidence that contradicted propaganda, proof that abundance existed where she had been told only scarcity lived, demonstration that enemies could show mercy. One simple dessert had changed everything.